What up, Coordination? How you doing? We are here today to talk about collective intelligence with Divya Siddarth and Raymond Zhong of Versus. This episode is about collective intelligence, and we go into the ideas of composable local control, basically distributing decision-making, leveraging both a core principle of markets and democracy, under the idea that the closest to a problem usually have the most knowledge and the greatest stake in its resolution. So a core part of the GreenPilled movement is moving more control into localities, and this is how the best collective decisions are made. We talk a lot about pure tech and extractive tech versus regenerative tech, and broadly about technology in service of regenerative economies. This is one of the favorite episodes that we've done on GreenPill since it started. I think Divya and Raymond are both galaxy brain thinkers in this space, and I'm so excited to bring them to you in this episode of GreenPill. Without further ado, I give you Divya and Raymond.
ReFi summer has arrived, and CELO is here for it. CELO is the layer 1 blockchain for the regenerative finance movement. It's fast, planet positive, and built for the real world. CELO has committed towards producing a sustainable future from the very beginning, and is the world's first carbon negative, EVM compatible layer 1 blockchain. CELO has become much more than a technology, a currency, a community, or even just a layer 1. CELO is a movement to create conditions of prosperity for everyone. You can soon engage with all of this via green asset Uniswap pools on CELO, benefiting reforestation and other regenerative products through the Toucan protocol, Moss, and more. ReFi is also about the health of communities, and Resource Network is creating Bankless infrastructure for circular trade and mutual credit networks to benefit small businesses and local economies, all on CELO. Follow along on Twitter to learn more about how CELO is accelerating ReFi summer for a positive impact on people, communities, and the planet. If you're attending ECC, visit the CELO Saloon to learn about what's happening on the front lines of ReFi from industry experts. The Opera crypto browser is the world's first web browser built for the crypto community. With Web3 support and a non-custodial wallet, Opera lets you access DeFi apps quickly and easily. The Opera wallet has buy, sell, and swap features, and of course lets you view your beautiful NFTs, but the browser still lets you use any crypto wallet extension you prefer, giving you the choice and flexibility for the Web3 world. Opera lets you view and manage all of your assets across all the blockchains all at once, and offers seamless multi-chain support between Ethereum, Bitcoin, Polygon, Binance Chain, and other EVMs and layer 2s. But Opera goes even deeper than that. Opera has a built-in homepage for crypto natives with the Opera Crypto Corner, with price charts, news feeds, NFT updates to make sure you are always on top of your game. And it even has Discord and Telegram integrated natively into the browser. That's crazy. Opera is truly building the battle station for the crypto world. Check out Opera both on mobile with Android and iOS apps, and on desktop too.
Hey, how's it going?
Fabulous. How are you?
Pretty good, thanks. Great to have you both here. Would you mind doing some quick intros and bios?
Yeah, I'd be thrilled to. Well, hello, I'm Divya. Bios have always been tough for me, but I am currently a political economist at Microsoft. I'm a researcher in residence at the Radical Exchange Foundation, a co-steward of Versus, which is how I know Raymond, and I also work closely with the MetaGov project and the Ostrom workshop. And I guess perhaps it is emerging the constellation of things that I care about, which are generally around technology and emerging tech, and governance and questions of collective intelligence as a way to govern emerging tech. And I try to do this through a bunch of different substrates only because I think we don't have the answers. And so working across contexts and institutions is the best I can do for now. And it also embodies the ethos of pluralism, I hope, in my own life. So
Beautiful. Can't wait to dive into all those themes. How about you, Raymond?
Hey everyone, I'm Raymond. I am a co-steward of Versus along with Divya, and also a co-founder of a project called Commonwealth, which is an all-in-one governance platform, and otherwise very active in experimenting with tools for digital governance and collective organizing.
Amazing. Two themes I'm really interested in diving in on this episode. So what's on your minds? I guess, Divya, you want to go first?
Yeah, well, as we were talking about right before recording, thinking about decentralization is top of mind for me right now. And in particular, and I think this is quite timely with obviously moves in the market, what does it mean when we call for decentralization and reframing, aiming for more decentralization into better decentralization? What is the right kind of decentralization that we should be aiming for in a system? And I think this is, I mean, on one hand, it's a political theory question. And my work started with, field work with social movements and political institutions in India and in the US, and thinking about how they coordinate action. And so that's kind of where some of my background is at. And decentralization is quite important from that perspective, but it's also obviously a core part of the socio-technical conversations we're now having around Web3. And there's incredible promise in decentralization that I think comes from focusing on what we want out of decentralization and how we structure decentralization to get there through what we or I call subsidiarity instead of redundancy, which I think is probably too broad to get into with a "what are you thinking about" question. But in essence, what is good decentralization and how do we get there is top of mind.
Great. Okay. All right. What is good decentralization? What types of collective intelligence do we want, and how do we facilitate that? Subsidiarity versus redundancy. All right. I've got some questions that I'm going to ask, but I'm going to ask for parity. I'm going to ask Raymond. What are you thinking about right now, Raymond?
Yes, I think all of the things that you've just mentioned. We're building all of these new systems and putting them out in the world and seeing some of them, completely. Some of them grow enormously large, and some of them crash and burn. And it's just like such an interesting time to be participating in this. Things I'm thinking about include how do we just like thinking about things from a very structural perspective, like how can we create digital spaces that allow for the kinds of interactions and this kind of collective intelligence to emerge, and then practically bridging that a lot with mechanism design and product design. So like, what do these systems look like when they're out in the wild and the first people in the world start to use them, and how do they grow into institutions after that?
Right. That's actually a really good lead in to I think your work at Versus, and I think that I've played with some of those sites, interdependent space. And can you tell us a little bit about how Versus plays into that sort of field of design?
Yeah, I think of Versus as a gathering space and sort of an open space first and foremost, because it came together around people who were, writers and researchers and artists and technologists, really thinking about how do we build these interdependent digital futures and how do we create a space where we are meaningfully working towards that goal in a loose confederation, so itself sort of decentralized. And for example, the Pluriverse artifact, which I'm much more familiar with since I was one of the leads on that, tried to articulate what does it look like to have a world in which many multiple ways of being and knowing interact with each other, and to say that that world is actually more powerful and stronger and can grow faster than sort of the monocultural technological space we've been given. And so again, that requires, right, people who are thinking about the technological side, people who are thinking about, the art and the how does that world feel and the philosophy behind it. People are thinking about designing the political economic mechanisms for that world. And I think Versus can bring some of those folks together. But really, the reason to me it's a gathering space is, well, we have no interest in sort of being the stewards of the pluriverse first and foremost, right? We have an interest in putting that concept out and bringing in as many voices and people as possible who are already thinking about these things and really fitting ourselves into what's missing in this ecosystem ecological space rather than like what is Versus going to be.
So could we get through a simple use case of Versus? So I've got pluriverse.world up on my browser right now, and that's also going to be in the show notes. It's basically a place where we can go and we can read about a vision for the pluriverse as opposed to the metaverse. I think a world where many worlds fit, and then you can sign it, annotate it, and fork it, and kind of attest that this is a shared value system that you have. And so this is a collective intelligence in action. Did I just summarize the use case fairly well? Like, any comments on that?
No, I think that's great. Raymond, thoughts?
Yeah, I think it's definitely very nascent, and we've gone through this journey of first starting out with the Declaration of Interdependence, where you could sign, to the Pluriverse artifact, where you can sign and create something of your own. And we're continuing to explore like what these patterns mean and whether we can develop them to a whole language that lets people sort of start to prefigure and create the Pluriverse.
Amazing. Yeah, I know I've contacted you a couple weeks ago because I'm looking to launch an essay with Oren McMillan about practical pluralism, and we were going to use Versus Tech in order to launch that. So I think making a platform for other people to build social movements could be an obvious extension of that, since y'all have so much traction with the pluriverse world. And I think interdependence.online was the other one. Is that right?
Yeah, exactly. And I think that is a core piece of the goal. Like, how do we build experiments that others can build on top of? And that itself is us. This concept of prefiguration, I think, is core to Versus and to me, which is how do you create the world that you want to see now? You're not waiting for it. You build that ethos into everything you put out in the moment. And that means that when people use and interact with and engage with what you're creating, it is already, that interaction is the world you want to see, right? And I think that is very core to what Versus is trying to do, where we as a small collective aren't going to replace the metaverse, are we? But we can prefigure what that would look and feel like. And the more people use that prefigurative technology, the more we are doing that transition already. And I think that's what we're so excited about, people using that platform in the way that you're describing exactly. And although Versus is very nascent, and we're at this point a collective of people who want to see something happen and are reaching towards it in different ways, it is that principle that I think underlies what is possible when you are small, when you're not going to achieve scale through something that is scale without change. It's scale through federation rather than scale through like pure growth.
What I respect so much about both of you is that you're just such deep thinkers on the theoretical level, and you clearly have such a strong command of these concepts from the theory, but you're experimenting with these deeply beautiful sites of putting those theory into action. And I almost see you in this theory action learning loop as you explore the space. Is that a fair observation?
I would say it's an aspiration. So if it also functions as an observation, then we're doing something right.
Okay, sounds good. I'd love to dive in on the work that you're doing in the collective intelligence space, and I'll ask a very broad question that I think I'd just be curious to have you take the wheel and steer a little bit, both of you. But what types of collective intelligence do we want, and how do we create it? I'd be curious to hear, I guess, from you first, Raymond.
Yeah. So I think like even starting from within Versus, like the community, I work on governance at Versus and have been sort of focused on that. And we're a reasonably diverse collective along like disciplinary dimensions and measures. And we all think about things in very different ways. And so how do we like go about reconciling all of the different directions and preferences and that we have as a group? And so we have been doing a lot of experimenting there and figuring out like a lot of this is not systematized right now. It's happening in conversations around the group. But as technologists, we're also thinking about like how could these things extend to design patterns that could like help people express their preferences in other governance situations. And to do this, we've been looking at tools like digital democracy tools and Polis and Lumio and other systems for doing this that are out in the world today.
Yeah, I think given that Raymond has done such an admirable job sort of describing collective intelligence in a specific context, I'm going to just zoom way out and say, why collective intelligence? There's something that feels inherently good about it. I mean, we want to be intelligence and we like collectives. But I think to me, what is separately powerful about the concept of collective intelligence is that it does something that nothing else can do, which is aggregate everyone's unique insights and perspectives in such a way that they are actionable. So not everything that anyone does together functions as collective intelligence. I think we look at things like markets and democracy and even bureaucracy as interesting examples of something that is somewhat efficacious as collective intelligence, because people talking together is not on its own collective intelligence, right? It's a substrate for it, but then you need to structure that in such a way that you end up with outputs that are usable and get you somewhere. And so I think when we think about collective intelligence, or when I think about it in my research, it is about what is the best way to do that structure without losing the collectivity of it. Because if you overstructure something, as we've seen across democracy and markets and bureaucracies, then it's no longer collective intelligence. You've gone too far in one direction, right? And so I think even if we zoom all the way into something like Versus, we are incredibly emergent as an organization. And so having too much structure kind of kills that emergence. And then what are we doing? But having too little structure means that there's no way through which we can, funnel our actions and get to somewhere collective. And I think Gitcoin is an incredible example of that. I mean, it's always a tension between how much structure you put in and how much community building and emergence that you enable. And that's really a core of also the mechanisms that we work on at Radical Exchange and digital democracy more broadly, because at the end of the day, your execution arm has to be somewhat expert focused. It's somewhat institutional, right? pandemics, say. Taiwan did an incredible job with pandemics, and I think it's a great example of collective intelligence. And that's because they use the collective intelligence mechanisms to define the problem, to source solutions, and then they routed those solutions through experts and institutions. It's not the case that collective intelligence ran the day end to end. And really figuring out at what points in a governance process you can best leverage collective intelligence and when to separate a mechanism and an institution. Like, I think we are experiencing small examples of that across all of our work every day.
And I think there's such a large opportunity to be working on this problem right now because we've got a global communication system that has reached maturity over the last 30 years. And then we've also got these nascent governance tools that allow us to really configure the way these collective intelligence systems are built. And it feels like an existential question for the 21st century, what you're working on.
I certainly think so. And same to you.
Yeah. So how do we, like, say I'm a project maintainer. I guess I am a project maintainer that's trying to balance. I love how you use the word prefiguration. So presets and configuration are two different ways. Presets are like, don't make me think, and configuration is give me all of the options in the world. And like, how do I balance that as a founder? Do I build for convention or configuration? Are there any sort of tips that you've learned to know? I imagine it's like almost like a rubber band where you can stretch it in one way or another, like, and then it breaks if you get too far in one direction. How do I know exactly where I stand if I'm a founder working in this space?
Yeah, I think this is, as I said before, it's a dance basically, right? And one of the most instructive things that can be brought into that dance to me are, what are the types of, and maybe this is just switching the question, what are the types of configurations that can be prefigurative over time? Progressive decentralization, for example, let's say quite specifically. Like, that is something where you have, the process is as prefigurative as the outcome. You want to get to a place where you're building for community agency. And you recognize that structure is required to get there, and structure means that you don't start out in that place. And in fact, if you did start out in that place, you would never get to your outcome. And so instead of setting up a prefigurative outcome, you set up a prefigurative process, and then you progressively decentralize. And I think this is something, it's dicey, right? Because you may end up not decentralizing. That's the problem. But I think it is probably better than setting something up that is, decentralized on its face, but in practice is fairly structured. It's a tyranny of structurelessness problem. And then you can't progressively decentralize because you haven't put in place any progress over time. You think that you're starting out exactly where you want to end up. So I think that kind of mechanism of process can be as prefigurative as outcome.
Got it. Okay. Kind of reminds me of Vitalik's article about legitimacy, which is the high order social acceptance of a system. And there's multiple ways to get to the legitimacy. You can get by legitimacy of outcome or legitimacy by process. And I think I heard in your answer that the process can be a way of kind of like walking the line of progressively decentralizing.
Yeah, and I think it's a question of also, I mean, practically, what are you decentralizing towards, and who are the people that you're trying to serve? And are they best served by the form of decentralization that you've chosen? I mean, I think that take something like labor unions, for example. They're not decentralized, right? I mean, in fact, the idea is that you take a bunch of autonomous individuals and you create something collective out of them. And in doing that, you lose one form of decentralization, which is the fact that they are acting autonomously, and suddenly you're promising to act as a collective in a way that may hurt you. Margaret Levi has this wonderful concept called a shared community of fate. She does a lot of work with ethnography work with unions, and it's kind of this idea that you expand your community of fate such that you're suddenly willing to sacrifice for more people. Like, if you go on strike, you may not get paid that day, and that could be really bad for your family, but you're willing to do that because you've expanded your community of fate. And to me, that is it's not quite decentralization, but it takes what we may want out of decentralization, which is local control and agency, and it puts it into another format. And maybe there are some types of decentralized technologies that can enable this. People are looking into that, and I think it's really interesting, platform co-ops, et cetera. And maybe not, right? And I think that was the prefigurative choice for something like a union, because there is a core collectivity that has to be found there. And some projects aren't like that. I mean, you don't always want to expand that particular notion of sacrifice in everything. Like Versus, for example, is going to be loose end to end because that is the type of structure that enables us to get to the outcomes that we want.
I see. So different tensions on that configuration convention spectrum will be right for different projects, it sounds like. I really want to pinch and zoom on something you said, which is instead of, I think you just said, what do we actually want from decentralization? You said local control and agency. I'd love to just pinch and zoom on that. So, why do we want those things from decentralization? How does decentralization help us accomplish those? And I guess this could maybe be a lead into the excellent article that you wrote in the Wired magazine about how the decentralization debate is focused on the wrong question, the degree of decentralization rather than the type. So would love to dive into all in any of those things.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, a quick rundown of the decentralization argument, I think, is this. Excessive centralization has many problems, right? It has problems of it can't anticipate issues. It has problems of technocratic control. It has problems of information aggregation. Like think about central planning versus markets. Why does central planning generally fail? They just couldn't get the information necessary, sort of Hayekian and Polanyi's concept of tacit knowledge. You just can't capture this stuff in a centralized way, and you can't satisfy people's desires, and you can't give them control over their lives. So that's centralization. These are the things we're working against. What kinds of decentralization actually works against those things, right? How do we solve those problems? Well, you can have certain types of decentralized systems that are really good at information aggregation. You can have decentralized systems that are really good at people providing decision-making input into things. Or you can have decentralized systems that are focused on architectural decentralization, which in the blockchain space, we call redundancy. Distributed ledger technology can be decentralized via redundancy, and that was created for security constraints, but in many types of actual technologies and outcomes that we want to see out of Web3, redundancy isn't the best way either to achieve security or to achieve all of the purported benefits of decentralization. So if we take something like data, what is the way that data interacts with global redundancy? Well, we already know it's incredibly inefficient in a lot of different ways. It's basically operating at the speed of distrust, which isn't the speed at which we normally like to operate. And it's not the most efficient speed at which we operate, which is why everything from companies to nonprofits, they spend so much time building trust so they can work better, right? And so why are we trying to operate the speed of distrust when instead the type of decentralization we want is something like subsidiarity? So to define subsidiarity, it is essentially local autonomy as much as possible, and then scale through federation, because you need scale. Problems we have at scale, you can't just have localism. You also need to get to solving global challenges through local communities interacting in incredibly strong and successful ways. And so I think when we go back to the example of data, well, instead of something that is redundant and, is on one hand highly private ownership of data, and on the other hand, highly public in terms of the way that data is stored, what if we had subsidiarity where people could pool data? It could be much more productive because lots of different types of technologies could have access to that data through scale, but you still have local control over the structure of that system.
The network structure that comes to mind for me, and this may be not a good one, I'll be curious for your feedback, is the layer 2 scaling strategy for the Ethereum network, where instead of just putting more power into the base layer, we've got these like subsidiary networks, layer 2s, that are actually have localized control, and then they just roll it back up to the federated structure. Is that an example of subsidiary? I'm not even saying the word right. Subsidiarity?
Yeah, I think it's actually a really interesting example that Vitalik has even named as his intention has been, you keep the base layer extremely neutral, and that allows for people to build more experiments on top and do things such as retroactive public goods funding, democratic voting systems, and by nature, like the base layer remains extremely architecturally decentralized, so that it allows these other centers to emerge, which feels like the same thing happening with federation, subsidiarity, but also there's this saying that when you decentralize things, like power accumulates in a different place and centralization happens somewhere else. And so the question is, like, when you decentralize something, does that re-centralize all the power in one place, or does it allow this like ecosystem of flourishing alternatives that's like pluralistic to emerge? So L2 is definitely a very solid kind of example of that.
Yeah, totally. And that's such an excellent point about the layer twos, because of their local agency, have the ability to focus on things that aren't a fit for the credibly neutral base layer. It kind of reminds me of the 50 states in the United States, like how they're kind of little laboratories of democracy. And then in theory, if things work out at the state level, they could be implemented at the federal level. So once you've opened up my eyes to this idea of subsidiarity, decentralization, I'm starting to kind of see it in a bunch of different places. What are the most promising models of subsidiarity that y'all are excited about?
I think that there are a bunch of different substrates on which I'm excited about subsidiarity. So one, when you say you see it everywhere, I think that's an inherent property of decentralization by subsidiarity, in the sense that, look, fully decentralized systems where everyone's atomized and individual just will not go on. I mean, that's not a stable state for an ecosystem, right? People will come together, they're thought to form collectives. Like, that type of decentralization is just, it's not the way that humans are, and it's not a stable state. On the other hand, pure centralization is also a highly unstable state, because you can't actually operate a totally top-down organization in reality. The world's too complicated. People can't be instructed perfectly. Like, you're going to do some sort of federation. You're going to decentralize in some ways. And so I think most of what we actually have in the world is just trying to navigate this tension without being explicit about it. And some organizations do better than others. I mean, let's take like a very old company, for example. A lot of reasons that old companies get disrupted is because they can't move quickly. And I think this is a lack of collective intelligence at the corporation level. I mean, it's the fact that they didn't succeed at subsidiarity. Small, agile teams couldn't move as quickly as they could. They couldn't do new things. They couldn't federate those new things up to the large level. And now suddenly you're disrupted, right? And so on the flip side, what are exciting examples of subsidiarity? I mean, to me, this is one of the reasons that I think DAOs are really cool, because instead of trying to be entire entities in and of themselves, you see a lot of coordination between DAOs to accomplish things together, which it's not yet as structured in some ways as I would like it. I think it's tending more to the decentralization side and less to the subsidiarity side, but there is a necessity of subsidiarity that is emerging. I mean, people are already like sub-DAOs, for example. Well, why is that coming up? Because it's difficult to run an organization without that. And so let's do that intentionally and on purpose. And I think identity is a really interesting place to start thinking about this, because identity solutions, we sort of started out in the technology space on one hand by wanting totally universal identity solutions. Everyone has a public and a private key, or everyone has the same biometric solution, or whatever, right? You want something that works for everyone. And we're realizing that's not how humans have ever done identity. That's not what it means to actually operate with an identity in the world. My identity is a product of all the things and places that make me who I am. And therefore, it's probably much more productive for a subsidiarity ecosystem to emerge. And it's already emerging. It's emerging with things like Bright ID and Web of Trust identity. It's emerging with some of the proof of personhood protocols, new work on soulbound tokens. I mean, all of these different things provide a plurality of mechanisms that are suddenly solving a problem that we thought had to be universal, and universal identity solutions at the same time are failing, right? And so we're recognizing universality can't work at the same time as we're growing the subsidiarity alternative. And I think when that happens, it's very promising. My one note of caution is, let's remember the failure modes. Because one thing that I think it's important to remember is that all of the problems we're trying to solve are not problems of the last decade or the last three decades or the last century. These are the types of problems that humans have been contending with and building governance structures for and trying to negotiate and build trade-offs into their lives for forever. And so when we think about identity, I mean, this has been true for hundreds of years, that we have to figure out what part of our personality and what part of ourselves and our families and the place we're from to bring somewhere new. What do you say on the first day of getting to a new city, right? Like, these are the kinds of things that define humanity. What do we identify with? Are we in a more communal society? Are we in a more individualist society? So let's learn from those types of things. And, universal systems, I think, are one of the things that have failed over time. And so will continue to fail, not just because they're architecturally difficult, but because history shows us that that's not the direction in which humanity tends to go.
Raymond, anything to add?
Yeah, I think when you mention identity, like the place where that has really evolved for me on the internet has been the evolution of identity in social networks. And that's everything from how people are shown and presented in the interfaces to each other online, to how they think about how they present themselves online and what parts of themselves they feel comfortable exposing. And we've kind of like gone through this speed run of that in the last 20 years or so, where initially like social networks are pretty homogenous, and then there were these kind of like crowded places where everybody was sort of streaming into the void. And something that people are seeing more recently is like you have the emergence of these internet scenes and subcultures, and people are organically, recreating these forms of subsidiarity and localism. And you will go to some of these scenes and they'll be very explicit that like that's exactly what they're trying to do. People use words like cozy, which is like as a meme. People talk about digital spaces and crafting identity for themselves online, because these are like really high stakes environments for a lot of the people involved. And the same way that this evolved in human societies for over thousands of years, like we're seeing digital spaces gradually rediscover the same ideas. Like when you enter a space, how do you conduct yourself? Can we make it so that a space is more habitable to newcomers, and people have a limited blast radius when there's conflict or something goes wrong? And all of these things are collectively bringing us closer to an internet that like actually feels more like the real world.
I'm gonna add that to my DAO vocabulary. Blast radius when something goes wrong. It's a good meme.
Immutable X is the layer 2 platform for crypto gaming. Immutable offers massive scalability with up to 9,000 transactions per second and instant transaction confirmation. No more gas fees, no more waiting around for your transaction to clear. Immutable's zero knowledge rollup finally unlocks the world of crypto gaming. Immutable X is the only gas-free NFT minting platform with over 26 million NFTs minted, all with zero gas fees. With the power of Immutable, gaming developers don't also need to become smart contract developers. They just need to plug in to Immutable's API and instantly start unlocking the full potential of crypto assets inside of games. This is why world-class companies and projects have decided to deploy on Immutable X, like GameStop, Ember Sword, Planet Quest, Illuvium, TikTok, and many more behind the scenes. So start building your game on Immutable X today at immutable.com. COINSHIFT is a leading treasury management and infrastructure platform for DAOs and crypto businesses who need to manage their treasury operations. Every crypto org needs to manage their treasury, and COINSHIFT offers a simple, flexible, and efficient multi-chain treasury management platform built on top of the extremely secure Gnosis Safe. With COINSHIFT, your organization can go from primitive single-chain treasuries to expressive, flexible, multi-chain features such as global user management, global contracts, proposal management, and many other features that can be shared across an entire organization. COINSHIFT layers on powerful treasury management tools on top of the proven security of Gnosis Safe, allowing users to save time and reduce operational burdens and gas costs. COINSHIFT even has data tools like account reporting across the 7 chains on which it operates. Used by industry powerhouses such as Uniswap Grants, Balancer, Consensus, and Messari, COINSHIFT is speeding up the coordination and efficiency of the organizations that use it. In DeFi, you have to keep up with the frontier, and COINSHIFT makes that easy. So sign up at coinshift.xyz/bankless.
What else do you want to talk about with collective intelligence? I just want to completely broaden the space because I think that you all know where the nuggets are, not me. I guess I'll throw it to you, Divya.
I guess what I'm thinking about with collective intelligence part of the time is the stakes of collective intelligence. Like, what are the stakes of our project right now? And to me, the stakes are really high in the sense that, I've been reading Lewis Mumford recently and his work on authoritarian and democratic techniques, and sort of this idea that there is an inherent kind of technology and technical systems have been inherently authoritarian or inherently democratic over history. And, I think that we often think about both authoritarianism and democracy as nation state concepts, right? For example, things that are in the US tech ecosystem are democratic, and things that are in an authoritarian country's tech ecosystem, Russia, say, are authoritarian. But in reality, I think those are the types of concepts that can be applied to small-scale subunits very productively. And therefore, the stakes of something like collective intelligence are both normative in the sense that, we want to build for democracy because we believe that it is just, but there's a stake in building good collective intelligence systems to prove the case for democracy, such that that's the direction in which we build. And I feel that to me is the core of why we do this work, because we not only want to say, these are good things to do, but also let's make these the most effective systems we've ever seen so that we keep building in these types of directions. And so I think for all of these different parts of it that I've been advocating on, whether it's identity or, data transfer and data ownership or organizational innovation, it's the idea to constantly be making the collective intelligence work better than other types of solutions. And so for identity, it's really important to say, we're not giving something up in terms of ability to use the system, ease of use, scale through federation, growth, all of those kinds of things, because we've chosen a democratic approach. Instead, we are building something that will solve the problems of the world much better. And one of my kind of core examples of this, when I was in India, I interacted a lot and sort of worked on the fringes of centralized identity system like Aadhaar. And I think this is an incredibly concerning project to me. And for folks who aren't familiar, it's biometric identity for every citizen. It's basically required for a lot of interactions, most interactions, and all with the state. And a lot of critics of Aadhaar will point to the fact that it's used to track people of different religions. It has major privacy issues because it's stored totally centrally and all of that. But to me, the real core issue is something that it's a concentration of power issue that results in all of these other things, right? But critics sometimes miss the fact that Aadhaar works in some cases. Like we have to be able to vocalize that. It is useful for people to have identities. It's useful for people to be able to interact directly with the government in certain ways. It's useful for direct cash transfers to be possible when they weren't possible before. It has disintermediated some forms of corruption, right? It's not all bad. And so if we're going to try to criticize and be better than systems like that, and Aadhaar, I think, is just an example of the type of system that exists in many different places across the world, then our alternative has to have the pros, has to be able to do those kinds of things and not have the cons. And so I think that is the task of people who are in this space. And what I see as my task and our task is to prove that point through efficacy as well as through what we think is just.
Amazing. Raymond, anything to add?
Yeah, I think Divya and I definitely both come to this space with this like spirit and natural interest in democracy and pluralism. That like this feels like it has the right vibes for us. But it's hard to advocate for any kind of ideology that way, even if it is a democracy. And when I've been involved in projects like designing the governance for a DAO, or even just like introducing the concept of governance, it's definitely very hard to approach these things directly. And that's why we have to think of all of these mechanisms, and even like the concept of generalizing this to collective intelligence to turn it into something that is like appealing and useful for people. And I think it's only going to be, when we have really evolved tools and prototypes and prefigurative artifacts out there that people can experiment with and say, like, actually, this is something that would be really nice for my organization, or the way that I design my protocol to like use this identity system, as opposed to something that keeps everything on chain and in public. It's only when we get there and that the solutions are very appealing to people that we'll know that this is something that can stick around. Because we're in the very early days of this decentralization, and watching how tech has evolved over the last 20 years. There's a lot of people who see echoes of early sentiment around crowdsourcing and Wikipedia and all of these information systems, and they saw that a lot of that ended up quite centralized in the end.
Yeah, I think so. I guess I'm wondering, what does maximum collective intelligence look like? Like, what is maximum coordination? Play it forward 10 years and tell me what what we could see in the year 2032 if we maximize our ability to create coordination and collective intelligence at scale. Like, can you take me into that future?
I think it kind of looks like good vibes. It looks like people being in harmony with the computer systems they're using, and it connecting people to other people around them. It feels like it's the opposite of atomization in a lot of ways.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think that, let's take it sort of the interactions that we have day to day, right? Like, who makes decisions over me? Well, my workplace, probably my government, probably some measure of like the people who are around me in local space have some voice in my life, my family and friends. All of these kinds of places in which decision making happens. And then there's a lot of decision making I have so little control over, right? Like US foreign policy, what's going on at the UN. I mean, these are things that are going to happen in our collective intelligence world still. And we don't want to have maximum coordination in the sense that we get rid of institutions and replace them with some form of emergence. So what are the best ways, what are the best institutions that can best funnel collective intelligence is what we will have in the maximum collective intelligence world, I think. And so that will look like, doing types of work that are we know are needed by the community, where the community can be local or global or distributed or anywhere in between. There is a way to figure out what types of work, what types of resources are generally required, and a way to plug into that and to provide those resources. Like that type of end-to-end mechanism, which is sort of what markets are supposed to do, right? I mean, at the end of the day, that is something that sort of works. It's not the case that the price mechanism hasn't succeeded at kind of doing that, at defining need and filling that need. But collective intelligence is better than markets, and therefore, it is markets, but we upgrade those mechanisms to allow for much more granular preference input, then we can do a much better job of that. That's also true on a more explicitly political side. We can do a much better job of, right now, I should have some control over various types of decisions that are being made around me. How do we make that control better? And how do we make it such that it is institutionally defined in a way that I have exit and voice over institutions? So right now, I may have some institutions that I'm familiar with. Say I'm like a big fan of the ACLU or something. Well, what does that mean for me personally? Very little. They email me once in a while and ask for money, and then that's most of my interaction with the ACLU. What if there were much more responsive institutions that I could both have voice over, in the sense that I meaningfully changed the way that they acted, and that I could exit from and move to other institutions so that I could vote with my feet as well? Like, I think that is a part of the maximum collective intelligence world. And there are a lot of pieces of this, and this is true for political philosophies that are process-oriented in nature, that do have to come from us setting up good processes at the beginning. But for me, I think about this almost similar to growth compounding, like economic growth compounding. A 1% annual growth rate over 50 years is like 64% growth, and a 5% annual growth rate, 64% growth in 50 years, I think, and a 5% annual growth rate is like 1,000% in 50 years. I mean, that's the difference that compounding can make for something like economic growth. I think that's a similar type of difference that compounding can make for something like better decision-making, better governance, better collective intelligence, where right now, even the types of things I can articulate are constrained. We're nowhere near the best political economies we can have. They're constrained. But if I can get us to 3% annual growth on collective intelligence, then boy, in 50 years, we'll have like 500% better collective intelligence than we have now. And I couldn't even imagine what that looks like. And so I think, while I have a world in mind, I really think about that compounding as the layer in which, differences can be made.
Amazing. I want to say back to you a couple of things that I heard, and let me know if I got it. And this is also serves to hopefully summarize for the listeners. So it sounds like, by the way, I just want to thank you for taking my question completely seriously. I just asked you to reach 10 years into the future and tell me what it was going to be like, which is a totally obnoxious question, but I think it's fun. So I think that we're trying to create coordination mechanisms that take what type of resources are required and get to those outputs of providing those resources. And the opportunity with going from the industrial age to the information age is that we can now get higher resolution data input into those systems. You gave an example of like, I think it was the ACLU emailing you once a month, and like your only data input is like, do they get money from you or not? But the future high resolution data inputs are almost like with quadratic funding, where we get 700,000 data points about what an ecosystem cares about in a quarter, and a credibly neutral substrate to input those systems. And within that credibly neutral substrate, you have to have a balance of prefiguration, which is presets and configuration, to allow people to still be able to input their preferences conveniently, but to the configuration bit comes in with the ability to express your preferences in all these different directions. And then I think that like the right to exit is probably important at some point in there, like to withdraw your consent from participating in these institutions. I always think institutions maybe isn't even the right word. Like, we're creating a coordination substrate, and institutions feels like an industrial age word. And then the last thing I'll say is compounding coordination over time creates this sort of event horizon that we can't see over. And that's why my question was so obnoxious to even ask you what this all looks like. So that's me repeating back to you what I heard. I'm curious where I got that right, where I got that wrong, just trying to summarize it and put in other words for the listeners here.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a fabulous summary and possibly more coherent than the input. So thank you for that collective intelligence in action. I like the idea of moving beyond institutions. I think that, my definition of institution is something like shared norms, processes, and goals in an entity, in a wrapper, right? And, in an ideal world, we wouldn't use the word institution for that, because I think when you say the word institution, what comes to mind is like old marble edifice, maybe a bank inside. And so, I think that shared norms, processes, and goals are the type of structure that we want to keep building to get to this future. We need a way through which coordination and collective intelligence can flow. And I guess one of the reasons I use the word institutions is because I sometimes become concerned about the fact that we want to move totally away from institutions and intermediaries and things like this. But what we're building instead is still an institution. Like, we can't get away from building institutions. And, perhaps it's a language question, but I think that it's important to reflect on the fact that we are building institutions whether we like it or not. And so let's build good institutions on purpose. And I think maybe that's a core part of my sort of maximum collective intelligence future, is that we recognize that when we are coordinating, what we're building is a wrapper for shared norms, processes, and goals. And that thing is important to build on its own, on purpose, rather than as a purely emergent structure, because we want some things to last over time. We want one substrate of stability as well as a substrate of growth. I think about, actually, our friend Jackie in Verses introduced me to this concept of pace layers from Stuart Brand. And it's like this idea that change happens on a bunch of different levels at different speeds. And so the top speeds are like fashion and art and commerce. And then the middle speeds are like infrastructure and governance. And the slowest speeds are culture and nature. And when we think about, at what layer institutions operate, I would say at all of them. And you need very stable institutions in some sense at some of the culture layers, as well as very fast institutions at some of the higher layers, right? And so maybe we should co-create a different word for that packet of things. But I think it's important to recognize that it will always be a part of how we organize ourselves.
Raymond, anything to add there? I feel like we're going at like 100 miles per hour. I don't know if you want to jump on the train.
Definitely thinking a lot about fluid institutions and governance systems as like examples of those, but also groups like Versus and other and Gitcoin and other organizations out there as being examples of this or working on creating this. And all of these organizations are experimenting with new models, and they don't fit into the mold of traditional organizations. I find it very reassuring in all this chaos to be able to like lean on the word institutions and say like that's the thing that we're trying to create. Like that feels good.
Yeah, the meme, there's certain memes that have come out of this conversation that are just sticking in my brain, and the combination of fluid institutions, I don't know, just kind of like tickled my brain a little bit to think about an institution, but it's not archaic and decaying, it's fluid, and does that mean, I guess it just takes higher resolution inputs and can respond to more data? How would you define a fluid institution? Or is that just a word that you just made up?
It feels right. Responsiveness, definitely. Some larger sense of like more holistic. It serves a more holistic role and takes into account preferences more holistically. Being another piece.
I'd love to pinch and zoom on, Divya, you said that you were kind of like, when I challenged the word institutions, I think that you reacted with a certain amount of pushback that like we shouldn't abandon our old institutions. I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I guess I'm just wondering, like, is there a spectrum between like our industrial age institutions to fluid institutions to web scale coordination substrates, and what is an effective way of taking advantage of the novel, but without moving too far away from the tried and true? Like, how do we oscillate between those two things? I guess I just wanted to pinch and zoom on that, because it seemed like there was some daylight between us in how we view these things.
Yeah, I think maybe I mean, one is that I have quite an expansive definition of institution, but I would also say, what about like Bronze Age institutions, right? Things like community and family are much older and are also types of shared norms and processes and goals. And, institutions, like there are some institutions that have been with us for, a while, but not that long, like nation states, that I think are quite interesting in that interregnum between things that feel old, but are actually somewhat new. And I think that something like nation states, maybe something that we would agree on or not have daylight over, need to be massively changed, right? Because the more the world becomes complex, the more the substrate of coordination that we need either goes down to the local level or up to the global level. And so then we have sort of like an archaic intermediary, perhaps in the form of the nation state. But to me, that's not necessarily just a step forward. That's also a real understanding of the historical contingency of nation states. I mean, some of the ways that original nation states, emerged out of corporate forms in some senses, and out of empires, and those types of institutions are actually quite recent in the grand scheme of things. And so, to me, I would say, am I wedded to the institutions of the last 100 years? Not necessarily. But what I am wedded to is, one, the concept of institutions, like the idea that what we are doing when we are taking these types of actions is partially, but not only, institution building, and that in fact is a good thing because we want institutions to channel ourselves through, as well as we want other things. And then two, to look into the history of institutions. I mean, I love like David Graeber and David Wenger's work for this, for example, where I think when they describe different types of governance processes, they're also describing types of institutional arrangements over thousands of years. And therefore, using an institutional lens can be very helpful. So if we ground ourselves in the present moment and think about, well, what do we want out of technology, in the next 10 years? Well, I think what we want is an understanding of the things that have worked for a really long time, which to me are these sort of like good, laterally balanced institutional interactions, and the types of local control that have been a part of human society forever, as well as now we need something new, right? We need to contend with problems at global scale quickly and urgently, and that's different. And we can't always purely look backwards for something like that. So then we have a new technology that can do those layers in a way that nothing else could. Now we can gather those types of preferences, as you were talking about, in a way that we couldn't before, as Raymond mentioned, right? These fluid institutions, that's something that maybe we couldn't have done, that we can't trawl history for, but so much of the inputs to those fluid institutions we can, and now we have technologies that can federate and scale what we have often and always wanted to do.
So question for you is Ethereum an institution?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
It has quite an
I think absolutely.
institutional vocabulary. It has
Easy answer.
It has
But I wanna-
tech, which is definitely
Got it.
not all institutions have maybe that much tech,
Mm-hmm.
but also
Right,
has the
okay.
other elements.
I mean, I would say like language is an institution, for example, right? I mean, institutions don't have to be things that can be approached in a shared way that contain shared knowledge and processes. To me, are institutions. Like a piece of art can become an institution. And those are the types of things that we come together over. So like, yes, Ethereum is an institution. Also, many of the things that are built on Ethereum are institutions. Then you might ask yourself, one might ask oneself, well, what isn't an institution? I mean, am I ever safe, right? And I think that, there are types of things when we move between types of institutions, like versus there were a bunch of people that came together before we wrote the Declaration. And it wasn't an institution at that point. And in fact, we are in the process of becoming an institution, and it's not easy. I mean, it takes work, and you have to figure out what you are approaching in a shared way. And so I think that, there are things also, I will say, that are not institutions, and that is, a part of the substrate, the ecology of humanity.
So the Oxford Dictionary definition of institution is an established law, practice, or custom. So to me, established means that it's highly legitimate. It has a high amount of social order. So, we're having this. Is that how does that land for you as a definition?
I think it's also Margaret Levi, actually, who maybe defines institutions in a slightly more expansive way. And perhaps it's really just the word established. And maybe established means different things to different people, but I would replace established with something like, shared and made legitimate or something like that, because established kind of implies a point of view. Established, who thinks something is established, right? And I think that is actually maybe one of the reasons you push on institutions to start with, is that it assumes a third party point of view and it's legitimated by an outsider. And that's not what we want. We want institutions that are inside legitimated. We're saying we are an institution and it makes it an institution. And like that maybe is the difference between me and the Oxford Handbook. But, I think that institutions can be legitimated in that emergent way, and that expands the definition usefully.
Right. Yeah, an established kind of implies an entrenchment that I think is maybe a feature in some places.
Yeah.
Like, with Bitcoin, it'll always be there. But the entrenchment means that you can't get away from it also. So I guess that's where I have an aversion to that definition. Okay, last question. Is there anything that I didn't ask that you want to talk about? And I guess Raymond, we'll start with you.
I think we covered a lot. There are definitely many more things we could talk about that would be fascinating to explore.
I know. To have you back. All right, Divya, how about you?
Yeah, I mean, hopefully we will in our lives talk about many more things. I guess to me, maybe this is just a concluding thought, like it feels like there is something of an open window of space, and technologies often open up such a window where we can reimagine our shared institutions, let's say, and ourselves perhaps. And, it's rare to have such a window. That's what brought me to this space. I sort of was working on other questions of democracy and politics and cooperatives, and kind of came in here because it felt like an open window. And I mean, I'm really grateful to you and to so many people in this ecosystem, and to forcing that window open, like keeping it open. And so I guess I hope that folks kind of recognize the rarity and also the urgency of something like an open window, where you can actually change the way that institutional arrangements are. And the gradient for that change is not always great. Like the default mode of where that change is going is like reconcentrating power and giving us mostly what we already have. That's always true. And yet some open windows allow us to redirect that gradient. And it's a tough job. And the most you can do is redirect the gradient. Like that, I do believe. Like you can't build the world from scratch. You can divert the river. And like I'm excited that so many people are interested in that river diversion. And I guess I'm just grateful to be a part of that space, and hope that people feel that and can work towards it.
Totally. So if I'm a Green Pill listener and I kind of want to steer us away from the status quo and steer us away from the failure modes, what can I do? What are the practical everyday muscles that I can be building, or things that I can focus on?
It's probably different for everyone. Everybody has a different set of things that they bring to the table. And there are a lot of pieces that need to come together for this to happen, right? There's we've been talking about a lot of the political economy and the ideas behind it, but as well as all of the work that it will take to operationalize this, from putting people together to building technology to making it a meme in the real world.
Yeah, I think if what we want is this subsidiarity, local control, then and this maybe is a trivial answer, but it's about how do you control your locality, right? Like that is why it's context specific. It's because this is an inherently grounded way of looking at things. But what levers do you have to pull? Are you a technologist? Well, can you work on building these types of technology? Are you already building a kind of technology that can move in these directions? What type of role do you have in the world? Do you have a community that you're a part of that you want to experiment with these kinds of things in? I mean, my first big governance process is I lived in a 50-person co-op for a while, and we operated on consensus. And I wasn't building any tech or building any, outside institutional capacity there, but it is an experiment. It's a way to prefigure the world. And I think there are so many small and big ways to prefigure the world you want to see, whether it's how you interact with your local community or on a Reddit forum, or, with your family or with your local church group or, your local government, all those kinds of things.
Seems like practicing it is the through line that I heard from you in all of those different areas.
Yeah, and allowing others to practice it, like being an enabler in all the positive ways.
Enable subsidiarity, enable decentralization, live in the new world, and build what's missing. That's what comes to mind for me. I really wish we had more time because this has been such a fascinating discussion, and I think that y'all are really on the vanguard of so many important things. I'm just so excited to see where your work goes, and I hope that it intersects with Gitcoin, and I hope we can green pill more people together in the world. Where can people find you online if they want to learn more?
Most of my writing is pretty scattered, but I'm at divyasiddarth.in and also my Twitter, Divya Siddarth.
And I'm at raymond.xyz, and you can find a link to my Twitter from there.
Amazing. All right. Thanks so much for being on the Green Pill podcast. Appreciate you both.